The dumpster was 8 feet wide. That's wider than the bathroom in the apartment Maya Calloway shared on Finlay Street. Wider than the hallway she walked through every morning, on her way to a job that paid just enough to keep her believing the plan was still working. But we'll get to the dumpster. First, you need to understand what she was before she found it. Because the box she built didn't come from nothing. It came from everything she'd already learned to lose. Maya was 24 years old, and she had a list. Not a mental list, an actual list. Written in black ink on a piece of notebook paper. She'd folded twice and taped to the inside of the kitchen cabinet door so she'd see it every morning when she reached for her coffee mug. Learn AutoCAD. Finish the last 18 credits. Save $5,000 by October. Apply for the Perkins & Cole internship. The list had been there for 14 months. She'd crossed off exactly 2 things. She worked part-time at a coffee shop called Groundwork in the Over-the-Rhine neighborhood. Independent, not a chain. The kind of place that had local art on the walls and oat milk before oat milk was everywhere. She was good at it. Not just at making drinks, but at reading people when they walked in, at knowing before they ordered whether they needed something hot or cold, loud or quiet. She'd always been good at reading spaces. It was the same skill she used in her design classes before she had to stop going. She'd left the University of Cincinnati after her junior year, not because she failed, because the math stopped working, tuition, rent, and her part-time hours couldn't all be true at the same time. So she chose rent and hours and told herself it was temporary. That was 2 years ago. The classes she'd taken were still in her head. The sketchbook she'd kept since freshman year was still in her bag, thick with floor plans of rooms she'd never build and layouts of apartments she'd never live in. It was the kind of habit that looks like dreaming, but is actually just thinking with a pencil. She shared a 2-bedroom on Finlay Street with her boyfriend, Darian Webb. 3 years together. He worked logistics for a freight company that moved goods along the Ohio River. Early shifts, decent pay, the kind of job that felt stable without being exciting. They weren't in love the way people are in movies. They were in love the way people are when they figured out how to share a kitchen and a calendar and a Netflix account without it becoming a problem. Maya had $2,800 in the account she didn't share with Darian. Her own account. She'd built it slowly, $40 here, $60 there, over 14 months. She checked the balance every Sunday morning, the way some people check the weather. Not because it would change what she did that day, but because knowing felt better than not knowing. She did not know on any of those Sunday mornings that Darian had lost his job in June. She did not know he had been waking up every day for 4 months, putting on his work clothes, leaving the apartment at the same time as always, and going somewhere that was not work. She did not know he had been moving money from their joint account in amounts small enough not to trigger anything. $200 one week, $180 the next, to cover what his paycheck no longer covered. She found out in October. The joint account had zero. Darian said he was sorry. Then he was gone. And 3 days later, a folded piece of paper appeared under the apartment door. Notice to vacate, 10 days. Dennis Kroll, her landlord, had known about the missing rent since July. He'd waited until the number was large enough to be useful. He wanted the unit back for renovation. The notice was 1 page, single-spaced, signed at the bottom in blue ink. Maya read it 3 times. The 3rd time, she finally understood it was talking about her. She didn't call her mother first. She thought about it, pulled up the contact, stared at it for a long moment, and then put the phone face down on the counter. Her mother was in Memphis. Her stepfather, Ron, was also in Memphis. And Ron had a way of making it clear, without ever saying anything direct, that the square footage of his house was already fully accounted for. Her mother would want to help. Ron would make that help feel like a debt she'd be paying off for years. Maya wasn't there yet. She wasn't ready to start accumulating that kind of debt. She called Trina instead. Trina Marsh, her best friend since sophomore year of high school, now living in a studio in Norwood with her husband of 8 months. Trina said, "Of course you can stay." And she meant it when she said it. Maya could hear that she meant it. That was the thing about Trina. She never said things she didn't mean. The problem wasn't Trina. The problem was Kyle. Kyle Marsh had dated Maya for almost a year when they were both 19 years old. It had ended the way things end when two people are 19 and not particularly careful with each other. Not with a fight, not with anything dramatic, just with a slow fading that neither of them ever named out loud. And then years passed, and Trina and Kyle found each other, and Maya had been happy about it, genuinely, because she liked Kyle fine, and she loved Trina completely, and it all seemed like it had resolved itself the way loose ends sometimes do, until she was sleeping on their pull-out couch, and Kyle was in the next room. That was the part that was hardest to explain to herself later. There was nothing she could point to. He didn't say a single unkind word. He just started turning the living room lights off earlier every night. A little earlier each day, by maybe 5 minutes, so gradually she couldn't be sure if she was imagining it. He set the air conditioning lower than he had the week before. He sat in the center of the couch when she walked through. Not aggressively, not deliberately, or maybe deliberately. She couldn't tell, just occupying the middle in a way that required her to angle her body to pass. Small things, individually meaningless. Together, they added up to something she felt in her chest every evening, around 7 o'clock, like a low-grade pressure. She couldn't locate precisely enough to name. She stayed 11 days. She left on a Saturday morning before Trina woke up. She left $20 on the kitchen counter for the food she'd eaten and a text that said, "I'm okay. Thank you. I love you." She didn't explain more than that because there was no explanation that wouldn't make Trina choose, and she wasn't going to do that to her. She took her backpack, her old laptop with the dying battery, the sketchbook, and a small toolkit Darian had left behind, a screwdriver set, a box cutter, a roll of gray duct tape, and at the bottom of the bag, a cordless mini drill she hadn't noticed until later. She didn't take much else, because there wasn't much else, and because traveling light was already starting to feel like the only version of control she had left. The thing she thought about most, walking out of Trina's building in the early November morning, was a small clip-on lamp she'd bought freshman year at the University of Cincinnati. She'd used it to draw at night without waking her roommate. She'd left it on a shelf in her old apartment on Finlay when Dennis Kroll's locksmith changed the deadbolt on a Tuesday afternoon while she was at groundwork. She hadn't forgotten it. She just hadn't been fast enough. That was the word she kept coming back to in the first weeks. Fast enough. She had not been fast enough for any of it. The shelter system in Cincinnati works like this. You show up. You wait. You hope. The beds at the main facility on Elm Street fill by early afternoon most days from November through March. And if you arrive at 4 p.m. on a cold Tuesday, looking like you haven't figured out yet that you're supposed to arrive at noon, the intake worker will hand you a list of overflow options and wish you luck with an expression that has been worn down to something indistinguishable from boredom. Maya tried the shelters for 3 weeks. The women's facility on Republic Street had beds available, but required participation in a 6-week structured program that ran every morning from 8 to 11, which meant she couldn't take the early shift at the day labor office on Cass Avenue, which meant no income, which meant the decision wasn't really a decision. A church shelter in Walnut Hills took her in on the 4th night, gave her a cot and a wool blanket and a dinner of chicken soup that was mostly broth, and then at 9 p.m., a volunteer came through and collected all cell phones in a small plastic bin. House rules. Maya handed over her phone and lay in the dark, listening to a woman 2 cots over cry quietly for a long time, and thought about what it meant that the safest place she'd slept in a week had just taken her only connection to the outside world and locked it in a bin until morning. She lost her good shoes at Elm Street. Someone took them while she was in the shower, left her own shoes behind, which were a size too small, and walked away with Maya's gray New Balances that she'd paid $78 for 8 months ago. Maya walked 14 blocks to the Salvation Army family store in her socks on a morning when it was 31 degrees, and came out with a pair of dark blue sneakers, 2 sizes too large, that she stuffed with newspaper to make them fit. She wore those shoes for the next 2 months, every single day. It was at the church shelter that she met Ruth Ann. Ruth Ann was 55 years old, and the first thing Maya noticed about her was that she looked like she was about to chair a meeting. Her gray hair was pulled back cleanly. She sat with her back straight. She wore a fleece vest over a collared shirt and she spoke in complete sentences that arrived fully formed, with a precision that Maya associated with people who had spent years being listened to professionally. The second thing Maya noticed was the stethoscope, old, slightly worn, tucked into the outer pocket of Ruth Ann's duffel bag with the earpieces visible. Ruth Ann had been a registered nurse at Good Samaritan Hospital for 19 years. In 2022, the hospital system completed a merger and cut 30% of its nursing staff in one fiscal quarter. Ruth Ann had seniority, but not enough seniority. She was 53 years old, with a mortgage she'd been managing on a single income since her husband passed in 2019, and the severance lasted 4 months. After that, the math stopped working in ways she hadn't anticipated, and then couldn't stop. She had been unhoused for 3 years when Maya met her. Maya lay in her cot that night, staring at the ceiling, and tried to find the logic of it. The 19 years, the stethoscope, the precise sentences, the church shelter cot, and couldn't. She was used to thinking of things as having causes you could work backward from. Actions and consequences, choices and outcomes. But Ruth Ann didn't fit that model. Ruth Ann looked like a person who had done everything right and arrived somewhere impossible anyway. It was actually the least comforting thought Maya had had in 3 weeks. She held it in her chest all night and didn't sleep well. And in the morning she asked Ruth Ann if she wanted to share the table at breakfast, and Ruth Ann said yes, and that was how it started. Ruth Ann had a system. Not for surviving. That word implied something temporary, something you pushed through until normal resumed. Ruth Ann had a system for living in the specific conditions she was currently in, which was different. She made this distinction clearly the first time Maya used the word surviving, and Ruth Ann set down her coffee cup and said, "I'm not surviving anything. I'm managing a situation with inadequate resources until a better situation becomes available. Those aren't the same." She had been on the city's housing voucher wait list for 2 years and 4 months. She knew her position in the queue. She knew the approximate processing time per case. She had a caseworker whose direct extension she had memorized and whom she called every third Tuesday at 9 a.m. She was not waiting passively. She was waiting actively, the way a person waits for a delayed flight when they've already checked in and have the seat assignment and just need the gate to open. She taught Maya things that no program taught and no pamphlet listed. Where the warm public spaces were, the main branch of the Cincinnati Public Library on Vine Street, the lobby of University of Cincinnati Medical Center where no one questioned you if you sat in the chairs near the windows, the underground concourse of the convention center on a cold afternoon when the building had an event and the door stayed unlocked until 10 p.m. How to fold a Mylar emergency blanket into an accordion instead of lying flat under it. The folds trapped air pockets, and air pockets held heat. How to choose a sleeping location outdoors. Back against a solid wall, sight lines to at least 2 exit routes, never a corner that closed behind you. How to maintain enough hygiene with wet wipes and a public restroom sink that you could walk into a job interview without the interviewer's expression changing in the first 3 seconds. That last one, Ruth Ann said, was not vanity. It's access, she said, with the flatness of someone stating a fact that had cost them something to learn. The moment you look like what people imagine when they hear the word homeless, doors close before you reach them. It's not fair. It's physics. The tent camp under the I-75 overpass near the Mill Creek had about 12 people in it. Ruth Ann showed Maya how to weight the tarp corners with broken concrete so wind couldn't peel it back at 3 a.m. How to angle the windbreak so rain sheeted off instead of pooling. Small things that were not small. The kind of knowledge that exists only in the people who have needed it, passed person to person with no documentation, no archive, no way to find it except by standing in the cold long enough to meet someone who already had. On December 4th, a city crew came with a dump truck and 2 officers and a woman in a puffy North Face jacket holding a clipboard. 30 minutes to relocate. The woman said there was a warming center open on Jefferson Avenue. Ruth Ann looked at her for a long moment and said, "The chairs there are plastic, and the lights never go off, and if you close your eyes, someone goes through your bag." The woman with the clipboard wrote something down and didn't respond. Ruth Ann went east. Maya went west. They didn't exchange numbers because Maya had lost her phone 2 weeks earlier and hadn't replaced it yet. They didn't say goodbye in any formal way. There wasn't time and there wasn't language for it. Maya just walked. And at some point when she looked back, Ruth Ann was gone. The evening of December 5th was the kind of cold that arrives without wind, which somehow made it worse, still and dry and complete, settling into every gap in her clothing like it had been there waiting. Maya had been walking for 2 hours. She wasn't walking toward anything. She was walking because moving was warmer than standing, and because she hadn't yet figured out where to stop. Lynn Street in the West End was quiet at that hour. A few cars. A convenience store with its lights on. She walked past the construction fence out of habit. She had passed fences like this 100 times in the last month, scanning without meaning to, the way you scan a menu even when you're not hungry. The chain on the gate had been clipped, and the gate had swung open on its own hinge weight, maybe weeks ago, maybe months. 3 brick buildings behind it. 2 of them still just frames of lumber and house wrap. One with windows already installed that caught the streetlight. All of them dead. No equipment. No workers. She almost kept walking. Then she saw it, behind the farthest building, the skeleton one, the one that was just studs and Tyvek and exposed plywood decking. A roll-off dumpster, dark gray, the kind that gets dropped from a flatbed and left for the duration of a job. The paint was faded, the logo on the side. Tri-State Hall Co. had been bleached by seasons of weather to where you had to stand close to read it. Weeds grew through the gap in the rear wheel assembly. One corner was dented inward like something heavy had fallen into it from above. She walked toward it. The rear had 2 barn-style doors, tall, hinged on piano hinges. She put her hand on the right door. The latch wasn't locked. She pulled. The door groaned once and swung out, and she looked in. Empty, completely empty. Floor was bare steel with a film of rust-colored residue. Walls went straight up, corrugated, cold-looking. No smell of garbage. No smell of anything except rust and old rain. She stepped inside. She stood up straight, not bent, not crouched, fully upright, the way she hadn't been able to stand in any shelter cot, under any tarp, in any doorway for the past month. The interior height was maybe 6.5 feet. She could stand up in there without her head touching anything. Then she put her arms out. She couldn't touch both walls. Not close. Her fingertips were at least a foot short on each side. She held that position for a moment, arms out, facing forward, and didn't think about anything particular, just felt it. The width, the way the space didn't press against her. Then she walked from the doors to the front wall. 8 steps. Turned and walked back. 8 steps. Somewhere between 20 and 22 feet. She had learned enough in her design classes to convert that instinctively. She didn't need a tape measure to understand what she was standing in. She sat down on the floor with her back against the left wall. The steel was cold under her jeans. She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them and listened. The building behind her blocked all the traffic noise from the street. There were no footsteps, no voices, just the wind moving over the open top of the dumpster, creating a low, even hum against the corrugated walls, like blowing across the mouth of a bottle. She sat there for maybe 15 minutes. She didn't make plans. She didn't calculate anything. She just sat in the quiet and in the space and thought that this was the first time in 31 days that she didn't feel like she was about to be seen by someone who would make a decision about her. When she finally stood and shone her laptop's flashlight into the corners, she found it. In the far left corner, a men's XL jacket folded neatly and tucked beneath it, a piece of torn paper in cramped handwriting. Back in 2 weeks. R. She stood looking at it. Then she set it back exactly as she found it. The jacket folded the same way, the paper tucked under the same edge. If R came back, she would talk to R. She pulled the doors to within 5 inches of closed, unrolled her sleeping bag on the steel floor, and for the first time in more than a month, slept more than 4 hours in a row. R never came back. On the second night, she got out the sketchbook. Not because she had a plan, because drawing was how she thought. She drew the dumpster from above, a rectangle, the doors at one end, the front wall at the other. She drew a smaller rectangle inside it on the left, bed, a small square on the right, stove. Then she wrote 3 words in the margin. Bed, stove, walk. That was the whole plan. She stared at it for a long time, and then closed the book and thought about what she didn't have yet. The floor was the first real problem. She'd learned that the first night, but the second and third nights confirmed it. Steel transfers cold the way copper transfers electricity, efficiently, completely, without negotiation. She tried cardboard first, pulled from the construction debris behind the unfinished building. It helped for about 2 hours before it compressed flat under her weight and became functionally useless. She lay shivering at 2 a.m. with 2 inches of cardboard between her and the steel, which was the same as 0 inches once it had been sat on. She found the pink foam boards on day 4, 3 sheets of rigid insulation, each 4 by 8 feet, leaning against the frame of the skeleton building, where the contractor had left them. She didn't know the technical name. She knew they were the kind of material that didn't compress. She laid 2 of them flat on the left side of the floor, overlapping the seam by 4 inches, and pressed the duct tape down hard over the joint. Then she went looking for the mattress. She found it 6 days later, leaning against the telephone pole on Findlay, near a house where someone was clearly in the middle of moving out. Twin size, used, with a stain along one edge, but dry and structurally sound. She dragged it 14 blocks to Lynn Street. She stopped every few minutes to regrip the fabric, stiff and slick with cold. Her hands were red and raw by the time she wrestled it through the fence and through the barn doors and laid it on top of the foam board along the left wall. She stood in the gap between the mattress and the right wall, 4.5 feet. She turned around in it slowly. Enough space, more than enough. In the bottom pocket of Darian's toolkit, the pocket she hadn't opened since the morning she'd grabbed the toolkit and walked out of Trina's apartment. She found a small backpacking stove, compact, screw-on propane, the kind that attaches directly to a small canister. She remembered it now. She and Darian had bought it for a camping trip to Hocking Hills they'd planned for August and never taken, because August was when he still knew about the job and was already not talking about it. The trip had been her idea. She had bought the stove and packed it, and then the weeks passed and they never went, and the stove ended up in the bottom of the tool bag, and now it was here, in her hands, in a dumpster on Lynn Street in December. She stood there holding it longer than she needed to. She thought about the August she'd imagined and the August that had actually occurred. Then she found 2 cinder blocks in the construction rubble and a piece of 3/4-inch plywood someone had cut into a rough rectangle, and she stacked the cinder blocks on the right side of the dumpster and laid the plywood across the top, level, stable, exactly high enough to cook standing up without bending. She set the stove on the plywood, screwed in a canister, turned the knob. The igniter clicked twice, and then the flame appeared, small, blue, completely steady. She stood there in the dumpster, watching that small flame and the steam rising off the water she'd poured into her only pot, and she thought, the trip didn't happen, but the stove is here and it's working, and the water is heating up. The rain came on day 5. She had no roof. The water came straight through the open top, soaked the mattress in 20 minutes, soaked the foam boards, pooled on the steel floor. She dragged the mattress out and leaned it against the building to dry. It rained for 2 more days. She slept on the bare foam with a garbage bag over her hips and waited. She bought a blue poly tarp, 8 by 10 feet, $7 at Dollar General on Central Parkway, and stretched it across the top of the dumpster, tying the corners to the top rail with bungee cords she'd pulled from a pile of discarded moving supplies behind a storage facility on Jess Street. The first night it rained with the tarp on, the tarp sagged in the center, collected water, sagged more, and at 1 a.m., dumped everything at once, directly onto the mattress in a single cold collapse that soaked through the foam and left her sitting in the dark, listening to water drip off the walls. She sat there for a while. She wasn't crying. She was trying to understand the physics. The tarp needed a ridge, something high in the center, so water would run toward the edges instead of pooling in the middle. She had a broom handle she'd found in the debris pile. She wedged it vertically between the 2 long walls, propped against the top rail on each side, and draped the tarp over it so it peaked in the center like a tent. The next rain came 3 days later. The water ran to the sides and off the edges. The mattress stayed dry. She lay on it and listened to the rain hitting the outside of the tarp and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the specific satisfaction of having solved a problem with your own hands, using only what was already around you. The win next. The rubber gasket on the barn doors had deteriorated to hanging strips. Wind found the gap between the two doors and moved through it at pressure, creating a sustained high whistle that she could not sleep through. She stuffed old rags into the gap. It helped but didn't stop it. Then she remembered the roll of HVAC aluminum tape in the construction supplies and pressed 3 overlapping layers across the exterior of the seam. The whistle stopped after the second layer. She left the third on anyway. The condensation took her by surprise. She hadn't expected it. On cold mornings, the inner surface of the steel walls was coated in fine water droplets, sometimes a light frost. Because her breath all night had been loading the enclosed air with moisture, and the moisture was settling on the coldest surface it could find, which was the metal. The drips ran down and pooled at the wall's base and soaked anything that touched it. She lost a pair of wool socks that way, left them against the wall overnight, and found them drenched in the morning with no rain having fallen. She moved the mattress 3 inches away from the wall. The drips still ran down. She stacked folded newspaper in the gap to absorb them and changed it every 2 days. Then she remembered the third foam board and broke it into strips and wedged them vertically against the walls on both sides of the sleeping area, not flush to the steel but slightly off it, leaving small air gaps between the foam and the metal. The condensation still formed, but now it formed on the steel side of the foam, in the gap behind it, and the surface facing the room stayed dry. Not perfectly dry, drier. She found the inscription on a Tuesday afternoon in January, when she was pressing the last foam strip into place and shone her flashlight into the gap to check the fit. Someone had scratched into the steel with something sharp, a key maybe, or a nail. TW was here. Nav 2022, Feb 2020. I made it out. 3 months. The person had been here 3 months and then left under their own power. Maya crouched in front of it for a long time. Then she took her own key and scratched underneath. MC Nav 2024. Still here. She didn't add anything else. She didn't know yet what the rest would say. The door leak came with the March rains. Water running along the ground, finding the gap under the barn doors, spreading across the steel floor near the entrance. She lost another pair of shoes, left them near the door instead of on the milk crate, found them soaked through by morning, dried them on the stove grate, and used half a gas canister doing it, and they came out cracked and stiff and unwearable. She got another pair from the donation bin at the Baptist church on Newstead. After that, shoes always went on the milk crate. Not the floor. Not ever again. She rolled a spare tarp into a long tube and wedged it against the base of the doors from the inside, then braced it with a piece of 2x4 cut from the scrap pile and jammed into the door frame's lower brackets. It held. Most nights, in heavy rain, a little water still pushed through, and she'd push it out in the morning with a flattened cardboard box she used as a squeegee. Emotional people, the same way she'd learned in the kitchen, at groundwork, when the dishwasher backed up. You learn things in kitchens. You learn things in dumpsters. The venues are different. The education is the same. The propane cost was a problem she could calculate exactly and couldn't solve. Each small canister ran about 3 hours on low. On the coldest nights, she ran the stove continuously, which meant 2, sometimes 3 canisters before morning. Cooking used a third of a canister per day on top of that. At $3.50 each at Dollar General, a bad week cost close to $40 in fuel alone. The day labor agency on Cass Avenue paid $10 an hour when there was work, and there wasn't always work. Some weeks she had 2 shifts. The math didn't work, and she knew it didn't work. And knowing it didn't make it work any better. She started rationing, 1 cooked meal instead of 2. Stove for heat only on the worst nights, single digits, wind chill below 0. On the other nights she layered. Sleeping bag plus a second sleeping bag she found at a Salvation Army drop box, stuffed inside the first one like a nesting doll. Added 2 Mylar blankets between the bags. Wore every layer she owned until she got into bed. It worked well enough on nights above 20 degrees. Below that, the stove came on, and she watched the small blue flame in the dark and did the math again, and it still didn't work, and she watched the flame anyway. The mold problem on the rain side wall she addressed with another foam strip and more newspaper. The raccoon that started visiting every 4 or 5 nights she addressed by keeping food in sealed containers and kicking the wall when she heard scratching. These were smaller problems. She had gotten better at smaller problems. Then in April, the cold broke. She didn't need the stove for heat anymore. And she noticed something she hadn't planned for and hadn't expected. On sunny days, the steel walls absorbed heat all morning, and the interior of the dumpster was noticeably warmer than the outside air by early afternoon. Not dramatically, not beach weather, but warm in a way that felt almost generous after 5 months of the same metal working against her. The thing that had been her enemy all winter was doing the opposite now. Same material, same walls, different season. She stood in the afternoon warmth and thought about Darian, not with bitterness, not anymore, just factually, the way you think about something that happened. January 14th, 2025. The forecast said 8 degrees Fahrenheit, wind chill below zero. The city opened 3 emergency warming centers, and the shelters went to overflow capacity, and the news ran a segment about hypothermia risk, with a graphic showing the danger zones on the human body. 2 men were found unresponsive in a parking structure downtown. One of them didn't make it. Maya stayed in the box. She had prepared for it the same way she had prepared for everything else. Not with certainty, but with specificity. 3 Mylar blankets under the sleeping bag. The double sleeping bag system. Foam on the floor and foam on the walls. The broom handle tarp peaked and held tight with extra bungee wraps around the rail. The barn doors pulled to their 5-inch crack. No more, no less. She had learned that 5 inches was the margin. Enough airflow to keep the oxygen level adequate when the stove was running. Not enough to let the heat she'd built up escape in any meaningful quantity. She'd found that number through trial and error over 3 weeks in December. She kept it. She ran the stove on its absolute minimum setting. The flame was almost invisible in the dark, a small blue ring, barely a whisper of heat, hissing so quietly she had to hold her breath to hear it. Not enough to cook, enough to exist. She lay on the mattress, in her sleeping bag, and watched the flame, because watching it was better than not watching it, and thought about the fact that the coldest night of the year felt less frightening than the first night she'd spent behind the laundromat on West McMicken Avenue with her back against the dryer vent and nothing between her and the parking lot. She was not warm. She wants to be clear about that, she told someone later. She was never warm in any meaningful sense that winter. What she was functional. There is a space between warm and dying that most people have never had to locate precisely, and she had been living in that space since November. And by January, she had gotten good at knowing exactly where in that space she was at any given moment. Morning came gray and slow. She was stiff in her hips, and her lower back ached from the cold that had seeped up through the foam anyway. The tarp had a half-inch of ice on its outer surface. She got up, lit the stove properly, boiled water for instant oatmeal, ate it standing, because movement helped the stiffness, and was thinking about nothing in particular when she heard a knock. Not loud. 2 soft knocks on the steel of the barn door. Then a voice, unhurried, not loud. Not the police. I've got coffee if you want it. She stood still for a moment. Then she stepped to the door and looked through the 5-inch gap. A man in his mid-50s, white, heavyset, wearing a canvas Carhartt jacket with a broken zipper held shut by a safety pin. He was holding 2 gas station cups, the large foam kind, one in each hand, arms slightly out to the sides in a posture that was clearly intended to show he was not holding anything else. His name was Earl Briggs. He was a retired welder who had been parking his F-250 on Lynn Street for years because it was 2 blocks from a metal scrapyard where he occasionally picked up work. He had spotted the faint curl of steam from her tarp gap on his way from the truck to the yard that morning and recognized it not because he was particularly observant, but because in the winter of 2020, after his wife left and he couldn't get his disability paperwork processed fast enough to cover the gap, he had spent 11 weeks sleeping in a construction dumpster 2 miles from here. He knew what that steam meant. He knew what temperature she'd been managing. He knew approximately how long she'd been awake. He handed her the coffee through the gap without asking to come in. She took it. It was black with 2 sugars, which was not how she normally drank it, and it was the best coffee she'd had in 7 weeks. He didn't ask why she was there. He didn't offer advice. He drank his coffee, leaning against the side of the dumpster, and said it was supposed to get up to 28 degrees by Thursday, which was better than it had been. She said that was something. He agreed that it was something. Then he said he had to get to the yard before they closed the truck gate, and he left, and she stood in the doorway of the dumpster, holding the foam cup until it stopped being warm. He came back the following Saturday morning with coffee again, and the Saturday after that. On the third Saturday, he looked at the tarp and the broom handle and the bungee arrangement and said, "That's working, but it won't hold heavy snow. You want something that won't fail?" She said she did. He went back to his truck and came back with a length of steel rod from the scrap bed. And over the course of that morning and the next 2 Saturdays, he welded a fixed crossbar across the upper frame of the dumpster, properly attached, load-bearing, permanent. It took 3 sessions because the work had to be done in pieces and the angle was difficult. Maya cooked rice and canned beans on the camp stove both days, and they ate sitting on cinder blocks with the barn doors open to clear the welding fume. Neither of them talked much. There wasn't a need to. Simone Graves had heard about the woman on Lynn Street from a man named Curtis who came to the day center on Elm Street every Tuesday for lunch. Curtis had heard from a woman named Della who had heard from someone at the library. The story that reached Simone was already third-hand and slightly wrong in its details. The tarp was described as green, the dumpster as smaller than it was. But the core of it was accurate enough that Simone wanted to see it. She came on a Thursday afternoon in late February, walking in through the unlocked gate the way Maya now left it. Unblocked, obvious, exactly as it had been when she found it. Maya pulled the barn doors open, and Simone stepped inside and stopped. She stood there for a long moment, not speaking, turning slowly to look at the foam-lined walls, the welded crossbar, the peaked tarp, the newspaper in the 3-inch gap, the cinder block and plywood cooking station, the milk crate with the lantern and sketchbook. Then she said, "Can I see that?" and pointed at the sketchbook. Maya handed it over. Simone was quiet for several minutes. She turned pages slowly. The floor plan, drawn on the second night, the notes about the tarp failure and the broom handle fix, the sketch of the condensation problem with arrows showing where the moisture traveled, the revised door seal diagram after the first one failed in the rain. Pages of problems and solutions, most of them crossed out once and redrawn, some of them crossed out twice. The working drawings of a person figuring things out in real time. "Where did you study?" Simone asked. "University of Cincinnati. I left after junior year." Simone nodded. Not the sympathetic nod. Not the "that's a shame" nod. The nod of someone revising an assumption mid-thought. Simone was a 5th-year architecture student at the University of Cincinnati, 8 months from finishing her degree. She had been sleeping at the Republic Street Women's Shelter for 6 weeks because her bank account had been compromised in October, a phishing attack that drained her scholarship disbursement and her rent reserves before the bank's fraud department caught it. The university was still processing the reimbursement. In the meantime, she went to studio every day and presented her work in crits and ate lunch in the architecture building and told no one, because in architecture school, there was a kind of exhaustion you could afford to show and a kind that you couldn't. And she had learned quickly which was which. She asked to photograph the sketchbook. Maya said yes. 2 weeks later, Simone used the floor plan, the problem-solution sequences, and the material notes as the central case study in her senior thesis on adaptive housing under constraint. Her thesis advisor, Professor Daniel Warren, read the first draft and wrote in the margin beside the case study section, "Primary source, verify." Simone verified it in person. Warren asked to meet the source. "She's not a source," Simone said. "She's the designer." There was a pause on the other end of the phone. Then Warren said he'd like to speak with her when it was possible. Simone said she would ask. Miss Patrice Coleman found Maya on a Tuesday afternoon in March. 2 women from a nonprofit contracted with the city's Housing Services Office. They'd been given the address by someone at the day center. They walked in through the unlocked gate and knocked on the barn door. 2 knocks, even and unhurried, the same way you'd knock on any door. Maya opened it. Patrice looked around the interior for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "You did all this yourself?" Not all of it. Patrice made notes. She asked how long, whether Maya felt safe, whether there were health concerns. She asked whether Maya wanted help finding permanent housing. Maya said yes. She had been saying yes to that question every time anyone had asked it since October. The problem, she explained, was that the standard voucher wait list was running 18 to 24 months, and she didn't have a mailing address for paperwork, and she didn't have a phone for callbacks. And every time she had walked to the housing office on Delmar Street to follow up in person, they had told her to wait for a letter that was going to an address she no longer had. Patrice nodded while Maya spoke. Then she said, "There's a rapid rehousing program specifically for individuals under 25 with no dependents. Processing time is 6 to 8 weeks. You've been eligible since the first day you walked into the Elm Street shelter." Maya looked at her. "Why didn't anyone tell me that?" Patrice didn't look away. "Because the intake workers at Elm Street are processing 40 people a day with a script that doesn't include that question, and the rapid rehousing program is administered through a different office, and the two offices don't share intake data in real time." She paused. "It's not an excuse. It's what happened." She gave Maya a government-issued smartphone through a connectivity assistance program and gave her a care of mailing address at the nonprofit's office on Reading Road. She said she'd check back in 2 weeks. Maya put the phone on the milk crate next to the lantern and sat on the edge of the mattress and thought about every week since October. The shelter lines, the shoe that was stolen, the rain that came through the tarp, the canister of propane she'd burned drying a pair of shoes. All of it occurring inside a gap, a space between two systems that didn't speak to each other, that she had fallen into and couldn't find the edge of because no one had told her where the edge was. She thought about Ruth Ann, who had been waiting 2 years and 4 months the last time they spoke. She called Ms. Patrice 2 days later and asked if there was a way to find out about a specific person on the standard voucher list. Patrice said she'd look into it. 3 weeks later, she called back. Ruth Ann had received a housing placement in April. She was in a one-bedroom unit in Evanston. She had been there for 3 weeks. Maya sat with that for a long time. She thought about the stethoscope in the outer pocket of the duffel bag, the precise sentences, the call every third Tuesday at 9 a.m. Ruth Ann had been right. She hadn't been surviving. She'd been waiting actively, and the wait had ended. Professor Warren reached out through Patrice a week later. He wanted to know if Maya would be willing to serve as a paid consultant on a university research project examining adaptive housing solutions under constraint. $15 an hour, remote work, no fixed address required. He wanted to use her design documentation with her permission, full name or anonymous, her choice. "Full name," she said, without pausing. She also asked Patrice about Earl, specifically about the disability paperwork Earl had mentioned was stuck in processing at the Hamilton County Courthouse. Patrice knew an organization. Maya gave her Earl's number. He answered on the third ring and listened and said, "All right, I'll try it." That was all she could do. She did it. The call came on a Wednesday morning in September. A studio unit in Walnut Hills, 420 square feet, subsidized rent for 18 months, utilities included, available in 2 weeks. Miss Patrice's voice on the phone was careful, the way voices are when they're delivering news that someone has waited a long time to hear. Maya said yes. She was standing in the dumpster when she said it. Standing in the gap between the bed and the stove, the 4.5-foot lane she had walked several thousand times in 10 months, down to the cinder block kitchen, back to the mattress, down again, back again. She said yes and then stood there for a moment after she hung up, looking at both walls, the foam strips with their gray tape seams, the newspaper tucked in the 3-inch gap, the milk crate with the lantern, the welded crossbar overhead, rust-free where Earl's welder had touched it. She moved out on a Thursday. She rolled up the 2 sleeping bags. She took the camp stove and its remaining canisters, the lantern, the milk crate, and the sketchbook. She took the toolkit with the mini drill and the box cutter and the roll of gray duct tape, still a third of a roll left. She took the small backpacking stove, the one from the camping trip that never happened, because she had decided she was not leaving it behind. She had carried it through 10 months of everything. It was hers. She stacked the foam wall strips in the corner near the door, propped neatly so they wouldn't fall. She left the mattress against the left wall. She left the cinder blocks and the plywood in place on the right side. If someone came after her, these things would be useful. She had not had to start from nothing. She didn't see why the next person should have to. Then she found the inscription on the wall, TW's 3 lines, and below them her own 2 lines from January. She took out her key, below MC Nav 2024. Still here, she scratched slowly, making each letter clean. Except 2025, I made it out. Bed goes left, stove goes right. 4.5 feet to walk between. MC. She stood back and read all 3 inscriptions top to bottom. TW and MC and the space below MC that was still blank. Then she pulled the barn doors closed behind her and walked out through the fence and didn't look back at the building. The apartment on Glenwood Avenue in Walnut Hills had a front door with a deadbolt that used a key she kept in her jacket pocket. It had a window with a curtain that she could open or close. It had a bathroom with hot water and a kitchen with an electric stove and a bedroom with carpet, 420 square feet. She walked through it in about 20 seconds. It felt like the inside of a cathedral after 10 months in an 8x22 steel box. It felt enormous in a way that was briefly disorienting. Too much space, too much air, too many surfaces not made of corrugated steel. She set the camp stove on the kitchen counter first, looked at it there, then moved it under the sink on the left side where she could see it when the cabinet door was open. The sketchbook went on the counter. The milk crate, until she could find a nightstand, went next to the bed. She didn't have much to unpack. It didn't take long. In October, Simone defended her thesis. The case study section, the floor plans, the problem solution sequences, Maya's documentation of every failure and every fix earned her a distinction from the review committee. The department awarded her the prize for best thesis in community design. At the reception, she found Maya near the coffee station and said she was being asked to say a few words and she wanted Maya to stand with her when she did. Maya was wearing a blazer she had bought for $11 at Goodwill 3 days earlier. She stood at the front of the room next to Simone while Simone spoke. And when Simone finished, the department chair shook Maya's hand and said, "What you did, the problem solving, the documentation, that's what we try to teach in 5 years. Not everyone gets there." Maya nodded. She didn't know what to say that would be accurate without being too long, so she just thanked him and meant it. Emotional people. Professor Warren's research paper was submitted to a National Housing Policy Working Group in November. The appendix included a reproduction of the primary floor plan from Maya's sketchbook. The caption read, "Field Design Documentation, Maya Calloway, Cincinnati, Ohio, 2024-2025. Maya read it on her phone sitting on the floor of the Walnut Hills apartment, back against the wall, an old habit, sitting with her back against a wall, and thought, the name is spelled right. 2 months after moving out, she drove past Lynn Street. She didn't plan to stop. She slowed down as she passed the gate and saw that the chain was still cut and the fence still open. She parked. She walked through the gate and across the lot. Behind the skeleton building, the dumpster was still there. The tarp she had left was gone, taken by wind or by someone else. But there was a new tarp on the dumpster, dark green, rigged differently than she would have done it. It peaked in the center with a clear ridge line. The barn doors were open about 5 inches. Inside, the faint glow of a battery lantern. Someone was in there, and they had figured out the tarp. Maya stood at the fence for a long time. She didn't knock. She didn't call out. She didn't take out her phone. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out a spare propane canister. She'd started carrying one as a habit she hadn't quite broken, and a pen and a piece of paper from her sketchbook. She wrote 4 words and a closing. She set the canister and the note on the ground directly in front of the barn doors, where it would be the first thing seen from inside when the doors opened in the morning. Then she walked back to her car. The note said, "Bed goes left. Stay warm, MC." She didn't know who was in the dumpster. She didn't know their name or their story or how they had found it or how long they'd been there. What she knew was that they had figured out the tarp, which meant they were paying attention, which meant they were going to be all right, or as close to all right as the space between warm and not dying allowed. She drove back to Walnut Hills. The camp stove was under the kitchen sink where she could see it. The sketchbook was on the counter, almost full now. She had been using it for the consulting work with Warren's research group, filling the last pages with notes and measurements and revised drawings, the same habit she'd had since freshman year of college. Thinking with a pencil, making spaces make sense on paper before committing to them in the world. She didn't know about the inscription that would appear on the wall of the dumpster 4 months later. She didn't know that someone with something sharper than a key and steadier hands would scratch 3 lines into the steel below hers. Dr. Jan 2026. Still here. She didn't know that Dr. would read her note about the bed and the stove and the 4.5 feet, would read TW's 3 months and her 10 months, and would understand from those carved lines that the people who came before had also been afraid and also been cold and had also made it through and had also left. She didn't know any of that. But Dr. did, and that was the point. The dumpster was 8 feet wide. For 10 months, it was the only thing between Maya Calloway and the ground. She was not brave in it. She doesn't want anyone to say she was brave. She was specific. She looked at a problem and measured the space and figured out what fit. Bed on the left, stove on the right, room to walk between. That's all a home has to be if you strip everything else away. A place to sleep, a place to cook, and enough room to stand up straight. 8 feet was enough.
Maya Calloway had many. She didn't have a room. She didn't have anyone waiting for her. What she had was a scrapbook, audio, battery, and 8 feet of steel. That's weight enough. When everything was stripped away, the apartment, the relationship, the blank tab inside the cabinet door, was in mind, what if it is what clarity. She stopped asking why this happened and started asking what fit in this space. Based on the left, stood on the right, 4.5 feet to work between. That is at home. Here was Maya understood that most people never have to learn. Resourcefulness is born from abundance. It's born from having no other choice. The tire fry, she fixed the right. The floor was freezing. She found the from every problem became a lesson. Every failure became a blueprint. She didn't wait to be ridiculed. She documented, she designed, she surveyed, and then she left instruction for the next person. That's the real lesson. You don't need perfect condition to build something that matters. You need attention. You need specificity. You need the willingness to solve the problem directly in front of you. We exactly what you have right now. If it was enough, what are you waiting for you to be?